Welcome to our discussion with the Latinx Parenting founder, Leslie Priscilla, on the movement to end Chancla culture. My name is Rita Sa, and I'm an adjunct lecturer at Cal State Long Beach, and I also work here at the Culture and Equity Project at UCLA Center X. And our special guest today, Leslie Priscilla, is a first-generation non-Black Chicana with Raramuri lineage. She is a mother to 3 bicultural children, a certified parent coach with over 14 years of experience. Leslie shares her medicine by offering coaching, workshops, support, and advocacy for Latinx and Chicanx families locally, nationally, and internationally through Latinx Parenting. Leslie's vision is of a movement rooted in children's rights, social and racial justice, the individual and collective practice of nonviolence and reparenting, intergenerational and ancestral healing, cultural sustenance, and the active decolonization of oppressive practices in our families towards liberation. We also want to acknowledge that as a land-grant institution at UCLA, we acknowledge our presence on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Gabrielino Tongva peoples. Okay, so I am so excited to meet you, to have you on our webinar. And so let's just get straight to it because I have so much that I want to talk about. So first, for those who don't know what Chancla culture is, can you please define it and then also explain briefly why it's harmful?
Yeah, that's my jam right there, Dr. Rita. And I see Latinx Parenting as an organization, but I do see it as the movement to end Chancla culture. And so when I first started kind of noticing the cultural aspects of parenting as I was working with families in the last decade and a half, I started to notice that a lot of the really hard experiences, adverse experiences that we have gone through as children have been related to through humor, right? And so the biggest emblem of this has been the chancla jokes. And the chancla, for those of you that are watching and you're like, I've never heard this word in my life. A chancla is essentially a sandal or a huarache, right? And so usually we'll see this in media, funny media, intentionally made to be funny media, where a mother in particular, sometimes a father, but usually a mother or a grandmother is throwing this chancla at their children in order to get them to behave. And so I thought that was really interesting because we're such a vibrant culture. We're such a beautiful people that the fact that this was how we were relating to one another was just really interesting to me, because as somebody who, I didn't get la chancla, but I did receive corporal punishment. Right. I remember myself as a child really well. And I remember those feelings, and those feelings were not funny feelings. They were feelings of hurt and feelings of, I almost felt like indignant in those moments where I was like, I'm just being a kid and I don't think I deserve these things. Right. And so when I became a mother, I started to figure, to really try to figure out, how do I bridge my cultural values and these more collectivist ways of being that I've been noticing. And I didn't have that language at that time. 10 years ago, I was like, how do I make sure that my culture is in my parenting? Like, I think that's how I probably would have asked it, And so I started really learning just on my own, just, how the culture is not about trauma, although a lot of the media that we see is reflective of that trauma, and so there's a lot of assumptions that this is just the way we parent. This is just the way our people are. And the more that I learned, the more I realized that that's actually a secondary adaptation, or it's an adaptation to a lot of the oppression and more colonial ways of being that we were passed down in the last 500 years. And so my goal really with Latinx Parenting is to not detach the history of what our people have experienced from these parenting dynamics and the ways that they show up in media, the ways that they are normalized, or the stereotypes that are built from them. And so that's kind of what the movement to end chancla culture is an invitation for people to understand that our history is really complex, and it's very much something that we have to contend with if we're going to be able to move forward and raise children in a way that is more aligned with the principles that are more indigenous, actually, of being collaborative with children and of being, power with children and of honoring children and of making sure that they are feeling valued, right, as people, not just as these whatever, dehumanized beings that need fixing, right? And so that's really what the movement to end chancla culture is. And you had a second question. I don't know if I answered it or not, but if you could repeat it, and then I can make sure that I do answer it.
Yeah, no problem. The second question was more about if you can explain why it's harmful,
Yeah.
and you can answer it, specifically in the idea of like just childhood itself, or as we grow into adults who end up having children ourselves, or even go into education. But why is chocolate culture so harmful?
Yeah, so chancla culture to me is like colonizer culture, right? And so any authoritarianism that is experienced in the context of Latinx families is what I would call chancla culture. And so this actually is not even just about parents and children, although that's where the conversation usually begins. But we also want to talk about the kinds of internalized chancletazos that we give ourselves, or our ideas about worth, our ideas about our own value, about what we deserve, about the rights that we should have access to or not, right? And so it kind of goes outward from there. And one of the things that for me has been really important to convey to folks is that chancla culture is something that, like white supremacy, just all kinds of systems, like this is something that we've just been in for so long that even I perpetuate chancla culture. The ways that I think about myself, or the ways that I talk about myself, or sometimes, the chancla for me isn't necessarily the physical chancla at my kids, but sometimes I do yell at them, right?
Mhm.
Sometimes I do say things that I regret. And so to me, that's still a part of chancla culture. Chancla culture is really the manifestation of authoritarianism, of power over dynamics in any relationship within Latinx culture. And so that does translate into adulthood, right? If I have been even yelled at, for me, my mom again did use corporal punishment, but for me it was mostly verbal, right? It was mostly yelling also. And so she ended up breaking a lot of cycles that were started by her parents, her grandparents. And when she heard about chancla culture, she was like, I wish I had gotten la chancla, because what I got was so much worse. The way that children were treated when she was growing up in that time were so much worse than even just the chancla, right? And so I really want to emphasize that, like, every generation is kind of learning a little bit more about this. But yeah, I think, for me, it has translated into, for example, my mom was always really adamant about making sure that I was always doing something, right? And that's something that, like, culturally, we're always like, we need to be doing something. Like, that's where our value, our labor is our value. Labor equals value. And if you're not laboring, then you must not be valuable. And I think a lot of us who have grown up in immigrant communities, especially both my parents are Mexican immigrants, I think a lot of us have this, right? And so the messaging that I received was, if you are not working, if you are not doing something, then you're not being of value. And so every now and then I am resting in my office and I'm like trying to battle these messages about, how I'm lazy for resting, or how I'm not doing enough, right? There's all of these messages that come in. And for me, all of that comes from, it's not just from my mom, because that was the message that she received as well, right? And so we can't, again, remove necessarily like the cultural history, the ancestral history, the fact that this is intergenerational, from those little moments where I'm resting on the couch and thinking to myself that I'm not of value, right? And so for me, all of that falls under chancla culture, and it's still something that I'm navigating, just reflecting on that internalized oppression and that internalized messaging.
Oh yeah. I 100% relate to you. I, grew up Korean, not grew up Korean. I am Korean, but I grew up with parents who are immigrants from Korea. And it's the same message. And, when I became an adult, I ended up having so much anxiety. I did not realize it was anxiety, and it started manifesting in other ways when I went to therapy. Finally, I think when I was 30,
Mhm.
one of the main messages that my therapist had me repeat over and over, and it had to become a narrative, was uh, rest is productive. And that was really hard to understand. But yeah, I mean, it's a lot, especially as immigrants, they pound into us this message that I came here for you, so you don't get to be lazy. Right? And there's also a lot of communication of like, look how hard we work for you. And it's our whole life. I understand it, but yeah, it is very, very hard to live up to that. And so I've been following you for a long time on Instagram. Actually, one of my students years and years ago brought me to your Instagram page. I have not left. It's phenomenal. And I've been wanting to reach out to you for years. But the real catalyst really was when recently Missouri, they instituted a new school board policy for spanking. And I wanted to touch on that a little bit because, we know that neuroscience tells us that trying to change behavior through fear is not effective. Like, it doesn't actually change the mindset behind the behavior, it just changes the behavior in the moment.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of cultures, including mine, conflate punishment with discipline. But I'm interested to hear your thoughts on this. So what do you think are the implications on schools implementing spanking as a form of discipline? I'm putting that in quotes. Yeah, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, the interesting thing about this is that this was up for a vote, and a lot of the parents were the ones that were pushing for this. Which to me, when I learned about it, it was surprising, and it also wasn't surprising. I think a lot of people, when this started becoming publicized, also weren't aware that there are 19 states that are still doing this, or at least it's legal in these states. They may not be doing it actively, at a local level, but it's still legal to punish children in these physical, terrible, terrible ways. And there are many, I'm like, oh my gosh, where do I start with this? I know we only have like 20, 30 minutes. I do want to say, before I forget to say it, that I'm a part of the board of directors for the U.S. Alliance to End the Hitting of Children, which is primarily the organization that's doing a lot of the advocacy work and really connecting with the students in Missouri and in other states as well, to make sure that this is something that changes. And so before I forget, I do want to drop that because it's really important work. And there are a lot of implications to this. First of all, it really is just reflective of a culture of authoritarianism, right? And so whether that authoritarianism is existing in the home or in the schools, it all kind of intersects in this issue, right? And so I think students are being conditioned now, and it's really terrible and really sad because schools, or just, learning environments, I should say, should be a place where children feel safe, should be a place where children feel regulated enough to receive knowledge and to learn. And so when this is happening, it places the body, and I think not just for the child that's being impacted directly, but for the other children that are aware that this is happening, or the other children that are witness to this happening, it places their bodies and the nervous systems in a state of activation, right? It's very scary. There's not that sense of safety. And so we think about how that would have ripple effects into their futures as well, right? And just thinking about teachers or authority figures in this way. And honestly, some youth, I'm sure, also agree with it because they've also been told that this is just the way things are, right? That teachers and administrators do have this authority. And also it's easier to accept because your parents also do this at home, right? And so where maybe you're too grown and too old now to be able to be hit by your parents, and that's not working for them anymore. Now there's this push for this to happen in schools where you're more confined, and it's more about how can I control you, as opposed to how can I really try to understand you and be curious about you and try, and so for me, this begins, I want to say it begins at the parenting level and in the parenting dynamics, but it really begins wherever there is contact with youth, wherever there is any kind of engagement with youth. That's where we really have to think about, how do I want to engage with this youth that's going to create the long-term effect that I want to create, right? So when I work with parents, we're always talking about, this, hitting your child is going to result in the behavior change. Like you were saying, it's going to produce this short-term behavior change. You might feel good with it in that moment, they might stop the behavior, but in the long term, what is that doing?
Exactly. Yeah.
And so I think that we need to, as a society as a whole, and not just in the US, because this is everywhere, right? Childism, adult supremacy, this is everywhere. This is not just in Latinx culture. This is not just in Korean culture. This is a widespread thing, right? And so the questions we have to ask ourselves are about the long term, and about the need, right? And about the if this is the behavior that children are engaging in, then what am I not picking up on about what their need is, right? Because it's not to, the need is not to get hit into submission.
Right. And you just had me think about something. One of the ways that I'm seeing it almost trickled down to the younger generation is, and I know there's so many facets and levels to cancel culture, not chocolate culture, but cancel culture. But it really, essentially, it's the same thing. It's like punishment for your behavior whenever you conducted it.
Yeah.
But it's, it's another way of a practice that's really, really about punishment.
Yeah, I mean, it's a whole paradigm, right? And I feel like the more that I have learned about Indigenous values and the things that we lost a lot of access to as a result of colonization, the more I know and I feel in my body that moving away from this is going to take like a whole reconfiguration of our mentalities, of our spiritualities, like of everything, right? Just like at every level in us, we have to really reframe ideas about punishment, redemption. Religion enters into this conversation as well, and how that reinforces certain values. And no shade to anybody that is a practicing Christian or anything like that, but we're just looking at it historically and the ways that has had influence on ideas of who deserve, who's a sinner, who is somebody who's more righteous and is going to get into heaven. And I grew up Catholic my entire life, so I feel like I have a little bit of insight into this as well. On the way that I was raised in a lot of fear-based paradigm in many ways. And so it's definitely a shift more into like a reclamation of more Indigenous practices and values, where we can look at a person and we can say, this is a human being, regardless of their behavior, regardless of what they have done. They deserve to have their humanity restored and centered. And that's really hard sometimes, especially for those of us that feel a lot of righteous rage, right, about the ways that we have been treated as people who have been marginalized for so long, right? It's like, no, I want revenge, I want this to be made right. And none of this is to say that accountability is not something that we need to seek and ask for, and that there should be, practices and restorative justice practices and transformative justice practices in place to be able to address those things. But I never want to enter into thinking about a human being as less than a human being. Right. And I think that that's what happens in parenting. I think that's what happens in schools. I think that's what happens in every system, really. And it's really tragic because it's something that becomes internalized, right? It's like, well, I must just be a bad kid then. I must just be a bad person then. I may just not, deserve love and respect and all of these things because I've never received them. Or we go to the other end and it's like, well, everybody else is wrong and I'm the only right one. And then that's when things like narcissism come into place. And so, I mean, it's a big one. It's a really big one.
I got to backtrack a little bit because I know there are a few people who don't know what this term decolonizing parenting practices is. And if you can clarify that for us real quickly, because I want to be respectful of your time, but what is decolonizing parenting practices?
Yeah, so I think the first thing that we have to do is recognize the influence of colonization on our parenting practices, right? And so when we think about that authoritarianism or those fear-based things that have trickled down into our families and now have become cultural, right? Resmaa Menakem talks about this a lot in his book, My Grandmother's Hands, and about how a lot of things we adopt into our culture, but they're not necessarily our culture, they're traumatic retentions that have lasted generations, right? And so for me, the decolonization of those is to, number one, understand what those are, and to actively unlearn them, right? Like, I don't know if we necessarily need to I don't actually know if it's possible to fully unlearn anything, to be honest with you, but I think that there's a lot of power in noticing the influence and then to actively choosing something different, right? And so for me, for example, in the way that it looks like in my parenting, it's like I'm going to, whereas, in colonization and that paradigm of power over and fear-based practices, it would never be allowed for a child to question their parent or to ask their parent to be held accountable or to ask their parent to not do certain behaviors, right? And this has happened really frequently where I experienced discomfort when my oldest daughter, because I do have 3 children, my oldest one is almost 11. And so even yesterday, she was like, what you did when you did this really hurt me and I wasn't okay with it. And I need you not to do it again. And I was like, you know, like
Oh,
the ego has to kind of just like quiet down a little bit, and I have to recognize what's happening in me internally, and a lot of it is inner child work and really thinking about how this is impacting that part of myself that feels vulnerable to criticism and that kind of thing. But ultimately, the decolonization aspect in that interaction is the fact that she is questioning me and she is asking me to be accountable. And my job is to not take that personally and to be very humbled by it and to see her as a teacher of me in that moment.
absolutely. Yeah, and to grow up to be a woman or non-binary person who is strong and can use their voice in a way that's very clear,
Yeah.
because we know there are people who take advantage of those who can't do that. Very powerful. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
And final takeaways, is there anything that you want to plug? We want you to use this platform also for your benefit.
Yeah, absolutely. So we are really excited because just in the last few weeks, we launched what we call our escuelita. So escuelita is the Spanish term for little school or just
Mhm.
and so if you go to latinxparenting.org/escuelita, you will find a lot of our pre-recorded workshops. You'll find the ability to sign up for our professionals intensive. And so that one is coming up in March, and it's an 8-hour training that I teach. Really contextualizing this stuff for anybody that works with Latinx families. We've had doulas, we've had therapists, we've had dentists take this course. And so all of that and some of the smaller offerings are available via our Escuelita. So I would just encourage people to check that out, to follow us on Instagram, to sign up for the newsletter. If you go to the website, it'll pop up to invite you to sign up for the newsletter. That way you can see what we're doing.
Okay, amazing. Thank you so much, Leslie.
Thank you, Dr. Rita. I appreciate you so much. This was so great.
Thank you.